Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Gosha Wozniacka, and I'm the environmental justice reporter at The Oregonian. Today, I'm with Vivek Shandas, a professor at Portland State University in the geography department. Vivek Shandas studies the impact that climate change has on our cities, and he figures out what strategies cities can use to reduce those impacts. And today, we're going to talk about one aspect of climate change that cities urgently need to address, which is extreme heat. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Vivek.
Hi, Gosia. It's great to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So as all we have all noticed in recent years, climate change is very much a reality that it impacts us personally. Hot days are getting hotter, more frequent in Oregon and elsewhere. And I wanted to sort of step back at the beginning of our conversation and ask you why you got interested in studying extreme heat and other climate impacts. It's kind of a depressing topic.
Yeah, it can be depressing, though, communities have been living with extreme heat for centuries and millennia. And in fact, it's the temperature that really allowed our species, at least best archaeological evidence, to really move and travel across the planet. And as a species that has been very sensitized to hots and colds, we can live in places for a long time. And my family grew up in the 8 degrees above the equator, and that's where we can trace at least my family back hundreds and hundreds of years. And part of my reckoning with heat was going back and visiting my family regularly in South India and noticing that my experience of temperatures just got warmer and warmer and warmer. It was a very personal realization that mangoes were ripening earlier, and lots of the kinds of activities that had been done for hundreds of years were actually shifting. So human and social practices were shifting, not only the picking of mangoes and kind of the pickles and all the things we make as a result of some of the fruits and vegetables, but my interest really got piqued when I started seeing these ch- direct changes happening right in front of me. And I think that's what a lot of communities are experiencing now as temperatures continue to rise.
Got it. So you were seeing these changes in South India, where your family was from, and you were noticing that it was getting even more hot, even hotter than it was before.
Right, right. And just as I was visiting, I was hearing congressional testimony by folks like James Hansen, who focused on heat waves when he spoke to Congress in 1988 and talked about how that these heat waves are going to get more intense and more frequent and longer duration. And the climate models that were developed, even as less sophisticated as they were in the 80s and 70s, and they've only improved in their accuracy and predictability. Even those early models were indicating that heat was going to become a much more acute issue for human health and well-being.
Got it. And now we're here.
Yeah.
It's our reality. And we live in Portland, which is a large city. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why extreme heat is of a particular concern to cities like Portland. Why should our leaders, our residents, be concerned about this? And are we more at risk in a city?
Yeah, so as a urban geographer, I'm really interested in place, and I finished my PhD at a time when it was considered the century of the city or the urban century, and I actually got my PhD in a field called urban ecology, and it was the study of cities. So the whole argument while I was going through school in the late '90s and early aughts was that cities are a place that converge infrastructure that have a lot of people and of course have ecosystems. And we talked about cities, and we still talk about cities as human dominated landscapes, so places where humans are just the predominant species that kind of can make water go uphill, can really transform the landscape, can make wells from what you can make valleys from what used to be mountains, and can make mountains out of what used to be valleys. Humans are very fastidious in their ability to really transform the landscape. And this was a really big moment because in 2007, the majority of people globally are now living in cities. And that was a big transition because humans as a species lived predominantly in areas that had very few people. I mean, you'd have to go a good kilometer, a mile, if not more, to be able to find another house. And people lived on these And that's for the majority of human history. We moved from place to place. There were groups of maybe 10,000 ish, maybe upwards of 30,000. Some archaeological evidence would suggest, but we weren't up at million, 10 million people in one place. So this urban century really cast out this idea that this is an unexplored way of humans living on the planet, these cities and these kind of ways we're developing, and we don't really know a lot about them. We know that we can build them, we can design structures for people to live for a long time, and we had a lot of literature coming out about how terrible cities were, how they polluted, how they were really kind of crime ridden, how you don't get kind of pure and morally kind of heightened behaviors in cities. And so we really saw cities as a complex amalgam of infrastructure, social practices, policies, economics, and culture as a way of trying to live sustainably into the future. And so this was what really got me interested in cities, is that we had never embarked on an experiment like this as a species. And it does really matter kind of how we build these cities. Historically, cities were built with big walls around them, and there were invading armies, and the threats on cities were very different 500 years ago than they are today. And so what
That's right.
has got me more interested and thinking about heat as a topic is that this is a new threat that cities have really not grappled with in the recent history. Though, if you take it back 1,000 or 2,000 years, there were many cities right in the Middle East, for example, that were consistently seeing 90, 100-degree days and finding ways to design around that. So
Hmm.
there are some examples if you take it back far enough, but our modern city is really lacking any kind of real attention to managing heat. And that's where I'm really interested in taking some of the conversation.
Hmm. And what have you seen so far? I mean, from your studies, what are sort of the things that put cities more at risk uh, from extreme heat events?
Yeah, we've been characterizing risk in so many different fields in terms of infrastructure, in terms of kind of contractability of diseases and things like that. But with heat, it's one of these silent killers that really we don't know how it kind of finds its way to affect human bodies. We go inside when it's hot often, unless we're houseless and we have to kind of bear the brunt of the heat outside. And so part of what we're finding is that there is a really big difference in temperatures across a metropolitan region. We've done this over the last decade and showing that there are temperatures kind of that vary upwards of 20 degrees Fahrenheit from one part of the city to another at the same hour. And that's no coincidence. There's lots of reasons for that, and we can get into that. But I really am seeing that the measurement of temperature we've been able to do, though the understanding of how those hotter temperatures are affecting humans and communities is a little bit more tricky. That's the whole area of exposure studies that we're trying to get at. And you can be in a really hot part of a city, but you can have air conditioning inside and be just fine and bear through a heat wave no problem. But you're in another part of the city that's also hot with no access to AC or other cooling systems, such as trees or parks nearby, then you're going to face a very different reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to unpack a couple of the things that you said. So, the fact that temperatures vary around the city, which means some communities are getting hotter and others less hot. Why is that? Let's talk about why.
Sure. There's just really two reasons, and it has to do with policy and infrastructure. The policy side of it is that we published a study in 2020 that really kind of answered a fundamental question of why do we see these heat differences. We were able to show across 108 cities in the United States that a neighborhood is hotter consistently because it was planned in a way where it was segregated and disinvested in over generations. And for example, from 1930 to 1968, just over 30-ish years, the Federal Housing Authority and the Homeowners Loan Corporation basically codified a segregation policy that said some neighborhoods would receive mortgage insurance and bill, and so communities living in these what were called green lined areas were supported with parks and with with smaller homes and with lots of space between homes and with smaller roads. And while other areas were that were considered hazardous were redlined, and those were largely disinvested in, where they didn't get the parks, they got lots of large industrial facilities, freeways, etc. And so that segregation policy, going back almost a century, we were able to show that these areas that were invested in, those A grade areas, if you will, and the D grade areas, those were um, averaged in temperature difference about 5 degrees on average across 108 cities. And Portland turned out to be the hottest of the 108 cities in terms of difference between the red-lined areas and the green-lined areas. And that really is no coincidence in a sense, because those areas that were redlined were largely disinvested in and were redlined in part because there were immigrant communities, low-income communities, communities of color living in those areas. And those policies have cast a long shadow in terms of the impacts they have for current day exposure to not just heat, but we've been able to show urban flooding impacts in those communities as well. And there's other folks who have identified food deserts and higher levels of air pollution in those communities, and on down the list it goes. And so that's one part of the reason is that this policy, and the other is just what that policy has done in terms of infrastructure. We've seen a lot of disinvested areas when the cost benefit analysis is done to be able to site a freeway or a big box store or these very land hungry developments. They go right into those locations that are lower land values. And if you're disinvesting in an area of a city, the land values are lowered. And as a result, we see a great deal of these very heat retaining infrastructure like parking lots or big box buildings or low slung buildings that are made out of cinder block or brick. They end up in these red line neighborhoods, as well as industrial facilities that pollute a great deal of air pollution. And they go to those locations, thereby seeing those neighborhoods being a lot hotter. So we see that that's kind of a historical process that's played out. And we see that actually playing out even today, where some of the historically disinvested areas are seeing the rapid rise of development, are pushing out green space, are really kind of making it much hotter in those neighborhoods, even in the last couple of decades, well after those redlining policies were abolished in the mid 60s.
Hmm. It strikes me how recent those policies are in a way, and how difficult they are to undo.
Right, right.
Yeah. And what you mentioned also, I think, goes to answering one of my original questions: is why cities are, have pose more risk when it comes to extreme heat. You mentioned things like warehouses, low slung buildings, highways, parking lots. Um, those types of buildings and materials will respond very differently to extreme heat than a forest or a park, correct?
Yeah, yeah. Just from a land composition perspective, so that's what's on the land question. Different materials interact with the sun solar radiation in different ways. So, um, for example, when the sun on a hot 90-degree day hits a asphalt surface, black asphalt surface, the darker colors, the more dense materials holds that heat, retains it until the ambient outside temperature is cooler, and then lets that heat go. So what we end up seeing is nighttime temperatures really being amplified during in those areas that have a lot more of that asphalt, a lot more of those buildings. And it's kind of baked in, if you will, pun intended. And it's whereas areas that are more grassy, treed, take in that heat. And trees, for example, their leaves, they photosynthesize that sun solar radiation and make sugars out of it with water and carbon dioxide. And it really is one of those very different processes in different materials. And so that as we change materials in our building designs and what have you, we'll likely see very different experiences and of heat. One other
Yeah.
piece of that is just configuration of the landscape. So how we build, how we design our buildings, how we design our roads, where the predominant wind is, And trying to enable wind to move through a particular neighborhood really helps in cooling that environment. And we're often kind of sealing off the wind from neighborhoods so that it kind of gets that neighborhood with a lot less wind and thereby a lot more stagnant air, which then just heats up over time.
That's fascinating. Um, you mentioned heat mapping and measuring temperatures around the city. Uh, some years ago, you came up with a novel method of measuring and analyzing temperatures in a city. In the past, from my understanding, measuring temperatures relied mostly on satellite imagery, but you took a different approach and you applied it in Portland and also in many other cities across the US and even in other countries. Can you talk about this heat mapping approach and why it's important?
Sure, sure. Largely, it might surprise a lot of listeners that, as easy as heat seems to be, a measuring, as easy as it is to measure heat. We've been measuring our own body heat since we were kids with thermometers and what have you. It's pretty hard to measure temperature in and around a neighborhood or a whole city. And so part of what has historically been part of it is we have satellites that measure what's called long wave radiation, the heat coming off of surfaces. And there's a camera, basically infrared camera, on these satellites that are able to take pictures of the planet and kind of send it back and tell us which neighborhoods are hotter. And what those are essentially detecting are is a surface. It's a surface temperature, and that gives us kind of an idea of how hot the roads are, how hot the roof is, how hot the lawns are, driveways, etc. And what we wanted to do is take that kind of heavily technical approach and kind of open it up for more communities to be actively engaged with that. And we spent most of the time over the from 2010 to 2015 really coming up with a approach that allowed us to measure ambient temperatures. So that's air temperatures, very different than those surfaces. The surfaces heat up, but there's also cooling of that air as it moves up off the surface. So we got a bunch of people together to go out and collect tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of measurements over a single day. And that allowed us to really create much more high resolution descriptions of heat. And let me back up 1 second and just say that, when we look at our phones or we look at the temperature forecast or we hear it, that's usually based on one measurement from an airport near where, the city or the region that you're looking at this for. And so part of what that allows you to do is just get one measurement for a whole metro region is probably not super accurate. And so what we wanted to do is just get a much more granular description of heat by measuring tens and hundreds of thousands of measurements every 1 second. And we kind of go on by bike or by car. And we do this in the morning for a period of time, afternoon for a period of time, evening for a period of time, and sometimes even in the middle of the night for a period of time to get at a full day profile of how some neighborhoods or some city blocks or some households kind of their air temperature increases over the day and sometimes cools down really fast, and others that don't cool down very much at all. And then the sun comes up again the next day and continues to kind of store and retain that heat and continue to increase temperatures. So we were able to develop that method over that 5 to 8 years, and then we realized that this is not something that's just happening in Portland or Oregon by any means. This is something that might be playing out around the country. And we kind of
Mhm.
took this to NOAA and said, hey, is this interesting to you? And they immediately jumped at the opportunity.
Mhm. And NOAA is the National
Thank you.
Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Right, a federal
Uh,
agency that's really that's in the Department of Commerce, but is really responsible for a lot of the kind of climate and weather data. And the National Weather Center is connected to NOAA's office as well.
that's right. So it sounds like you've done these heat mapping projects in many different communities now.
Right, right.
Okay. Um, and how does it actually work? Where's this temperature sensor attached?
Yeah, we try to make this a community effort. So we're trying to make this not a complicated satellite derived technical emissivity and analysis of looking at a lot of these variables. We just have an on-off switch, and it's mounted on a car passenger side window, and it allows folks to just basically turn it on. The sensor connects to a GPS, global positioning system. Those are the satellites that tell you where you are. Your smartphone has one. Cars, a lot of cars have them, and it's just a way of knowing where you are in space. So, very geographic kind of measure. Then the sensor also tells you how fast you're going, so kind of acceleration, speed, and it tells you also temperature and relative humidity. And with those simple measurements, you can really start characterizing what is creating the temperature in one point in time. And the sensor is very easy to use. And once communities go out and collect these measurements, they're able to then where the group that actually analyzes these data are able to actually go about and cleaning the data, organizing it, and then creating these maps that show at a 10-meter resolution. So that's about 30 feet, a grid cell for a whole metro region. Every 30-foot grid has a temperature and a relative humidity measurement, which then also tells you what the heat index is. And we can talk about what the heat index is. It's more kind of what it feels like outside, rather than just a temperature, because it includes humidity as
Right,
well.
the humidity. That's right. That's right. And this mapping is done multiple times per day, right? It's not just a one-time reading. It's done
Right,
over
right.
several times.
Right. Temperatures change throughout the day. So we want to also control how there's a term called thermal drift. So as a area gets warmer, we want to kind of not capture the warming over the time period. We want to capture it right in the early morning. So we do it at 6 a.m. in the morning. So right before the sun usually starts heating up surfaces or gets warm. Then we do it right at the peak of the day, usually around 3 p.m., right as the sun is at its maximum heat. And then we do it in the evening about 7 p.m., so that we start seeing what areas have really absorbed that heat, are retaining it, and then slowly starting to release it. And so we're able to really capture that multiple times and tell you that some areas warm up a lot faster and some areas cool down a lot slower. So it's really interesting to see how the land and the design of the landscape affects those increases and decreases of temperature.
Mm-hmm. And the reason I brought this up, and I'm glad that we're discussing this in detail, is that Multnomah, Clackamas, and Washington County are right now in the middle of a massive heat mapping project based on this methodology that you have come up with, and they are going to be analyzing this data that they're collecting and mapping it out. And so I'm wondering what type of results we can expect from this data. What can this data tell us? Once it's all collected and analyzed, uh, what can it tell us as residents of Portland?
Well, it'll be pretty quickly. You'll be able to see a map that will describe whether you're in one of the relatively hottest areas of town, whether you live in a kind of a moderate temperature, or whether you live in a cooler part of town. So the hottest parts of town usually are about 20 degrees hotter than the cooler parts of town. And what we've noticed is as temperatures go up, so if we are talking about an 85-degree day versus a 100-degree day versus a 110-degree day, that difference between neighborhoods and between kind of cooler and hotter actually expands as well. So somebody would be able to say, oh, wow, on an 85-degree day, I'm in a neighborhood that's 85 degrees by what the airport would say. I'm in a neighborhood that's actually 92 or 95 degrees. And another person would be able to say, wow, I'm in a neighborhood that's only 80 degrees or 79 degrees. And
Hmm.
as we see a 85-degree day go to a 95-degree day, we would see that difference also kind of expanding and growing between these different parts of town.
Got it. So if I looked at my phone in the morning and saw, today is going to be a 90-degree day, but I actually know that I live in one of those neighborhoods that's, heats up another 5 or 10 degrees, I would have to keep that in mind and add, +5 or +10 to that. what I'm seeing.
Yeah, yeah, it's exactly right. I mean, we believe that we can handle an 85-degree day, but my neighborhood might actually be a 95-degree neighborhood or a city block, and that is actually a difference between living kind of easily and well versus starting to run into issues of heat stress. And our
Mm.
bodies respond to heat, and since more people die of heat than any other natural hazard, every year, we know that it's a very silent killer. We know that it's a very discriminating killer. Is that somebody living in a hot neighborhood, if they don't have access to cooler environments and they sleep and they go to bed and it's really hot, their body's ability to cool down is compromised, and then we start seeing a lot of those folks not wake up the next day, and that's the thing I'm most concerned about, and the reason why we wanted to get farther and farther precise and more granular, detailed data.
Hmm. In this data set that the three counties are collecting, this builds on previous measurements that you've done already at Portland State, but this is on a much grander scale, it sounds like.
Yeah. Yeah. The work we did at Portland State was largely around kind of, is this even possible? It's very researchy. It's kind of like we had research funds to see, is the instrumentation available? Is the kind of process of collecting data, are the analytics kind of in place for understanding and creating these maps? And that was all kind of basic research funded by folks like the National Science Foundation to see if this is possible. Though when we started seeing some of these results, it really turned into, wow, this is something we really need to take out into the community because this has direct policy relevance. And it became a question about all the things like building design, like thinking about what we put on the landscape, how we build, what materials we use. Like it became much more of a practical question of safeguarding our cities from extreme heat rather than kind of
Mhm.
a research enterprise that's confined to the university. And so that's an important distinction for me because this means that now with public health agencies and planning agencies and sustainability groups directly involved in the counties, we are going to see a very different understanding of potential impacts from this, and that there's direct ties to policies that these practitioners will be able to take as a result of generating all of these data.
Yeah, and that's one thing I wanted to ask is beyond the mapping where temperatures are higher and lower, what else can this data tell us? Can it analyze risks to particular populations or any other sort of analysis?
Yeah, yeah, it can go many different directions. In fact, the fact that public health agencies are really championing much of this mapping work this year is very heartening to me because a lot of this work is to kind of safeguard communities and public community health. And so part of what policymakers and public health practitioners will be able to do is really identify, we don't have unlimited resources to put in all areas of the region. So we will be able to discern as a result of this work which areas have the combination of very high heat, very low coping capacity, and very high health sensitivity of populations that live in specific parts of an area. And for example, when the heat dome came through in 2021, I had predicted in 2014 exactly where the people who were exposed to multiple days of above 100-degree or 110-degree temperature, where they were going to be the greatest number of fatalities. And that's exactly what ended up happening. It's not rocket science to identify a neighborhood once we know that it's hot, that there are other factors that contribute to the likelihood um, of grave health impacts. And so when we know that there's a specific neighborhood, for example, in the Portland metro area, we've really honed in on East Portland as being an area where the built environment combined with kind of changes in development, combined with loss of green space, combined with community vulnerability, all converge to really create a landscape of precarity, landscape where people are going to likely suffer from extreme heat waves. And um, so it really does allow policymakers in that sense to take proactive measures and what I've been calling for kind of develop heat action plans, so that we
Mhm.
know who is responsible for what action, what the process is for community engagement, how we can do that respectfully, how we can open cooling centers, for example, in places where communities can be served much more effectively, and that we can kind of distribute heat pumps and other cooling mechanical systems where we can put trees into the ground to cool those neighborhoods. So we can really do that work much more effectively so that temperatures can stay manageable and not impact our health as severely.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's talk about a couple of those things that you just mentioned. So, ACs, air conditioners, and heat pumps are helping people cool down. In the past, many people in the Pacific Northwest didn't have ACs or heat pumps, and after the heat dome, people went out and bought them in droves, and uh, those who could afford one, and then also the state and the city of Portland try to have programs to help people who can't afford to buy them to buy some of those units. So we're seeing more people who actually have ACs and heat pumps at home, but it's only been a few years, and it's sort of an emerging thing. And we still don't really know how people use these units. We know that people supposedly use them to cool down when it gets hot, but it's a little more complicated. And so I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about how our behavior has changed in terms of how we use cooling. Do these units actually provide relief from heat? And also what they cost us in terms of energy use, utility costs, and any other impacts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan for getting people safe during these extreme events. We really need to find all the possible avenues for reducing exposure to extreme heat. And we know from the American Southwest and South in general that air conditioning units and heat pumps are kind of the major go to for cooling inside homes. Places around the world use the similar technology to cool residences and offices and grocery stores, etc. One of the things that is done is that money is freed up in order to be able to provide a subsidy of sorts to residences who may not be able to afford these heat pumps and these expensive mechanical cooling systems. And so you get a free air conditioning unit or a heat pump and you get it installed. And the idea is that you can turn it on and it's ready to go. There are a lot of unknowns about this. We don't know right now how that's affecting a resident's utility bill. We don't know whether they're using it or not. We don't know whether um, the grid itself, like the electrical grid that supports these very energy intensive mechanical cooling systems, is going to be able to handle the level of demand that is now in a particular area. Our infrastructure grid is relatively old, and we have in the last decade we have tripled the amount of air conditioning units in the Portland metro region, for example, and that has really grave implications for the ability for a grid that wasn't designed, electrical grid that wasn't designed for this level of demand to suddenly be brought online. And so
Right.
that is a much larger implication. And we just saw a study come out of Georgia that compared Atlanta and Phoenix and Detroit, and it showed that if Phoenix's electrical grid goes down, emergency rooms wouldn't have enough beds to be able to accommodate the number of impacts that are going to occur in the Phoenix area. And that is a very likely scenario that we would see here as well, in that
Hmm.
many of us are not acclimated to the level of heat that we're starting to see. And it
Hmm.
would mean a pretty rapid emergency if we were to see an electrical grid go down during a 3, 5, 7 day heat wave.
Right. Right. Yeah, that would be pretty devastating.
Yeah.
Um, One of the another recent study that came out in April looked at cooling in affordable public housing,
Yeah.
and it was done with Home Forward, which is a public housing provider in the Portland area, and This study was really interesting because it looked at a population that was especially impacted in the heat dome. Many of the people who died were residents of public housing, but some of the conclusions of the study were kind of counterintuitive, which is that it found that having air conditioning installed didn't necessarily significantly decrease indoor temperatures for the people who got these new AC units. Why is that? And what did it sort of tell us uh, about the way that people use these?
Yeah, there's really two things that emerge from that study that I can discern. The first is that we don't know what AC use. We don't know what drives AC use. Some people turn on an AC when the temperature breaks 70 degrees or 75 degrees, which I consider a really comfortable temperature. But for others, especially those with pre-existing health conditions, those
Right.
temperatures get really hot. And in other cases, people turn on the AC when it only hits above 95 or 100. And in my household, I know our family is kind of more on the 95 scale than on the 75 scale. And so
Hmm.
we have very different varying levels of comfort in our homes. And that's broken out by different, gender. It's broken out by income, like running an AC often costs more money. And so folks who can
Right.
are deciding between, a meal on the table or staying cool overnight, there's trade-offs there that folks are making. So there's many factors that go into whether you turn on an AC or not. And so that may drive some of the results here. The other is that these mechanical systems, they can only cool indoor temperatures so much. If you have a very porous environment, you have a house that where outside air can come in really easily, and the AC is running full blast, it doesn't really matter how much AC you're pushing. That air is constantly getting replenished with warmer air, and the AC is
Hmm.
working extra hard. And we know that AC units also break and malfunction a lot, even relatively newer ones. And that leads to kind of suddenly thinking you have a cool environment and then not having that and not having anybody to be able to help you fix it either in a short term.
Right.
So we saw that, and we also saw that several residences. The study pointed to several residences that were um, using a variety of different techniques, like indoor cooling fans and water baths and awnings and putting shades on windows and opening windows at night, and really using a variety of different non AC strategies to be able to cool the indoor environment. And then seeing that those strategies were often having the same effect as having an AC on all the time. And that so the study
Hmm.
really pointed to the fact that, AC is one approach that we can use, but it does have its limits and it might go out. And the other is that there are tactics that we can use just to keep our house cool, that might also be a supportive environment. I understand that study is going to continue this year because there were several unanswered questions and hypotheses that emerged, that
That's
the study
great.
is going to expand into the next year to be able to really get at some of those questions of AC versus non AC, as well as green space around buildings and kind of really getting at coping strategies that individual public housing residents have.
Yeah, thank you for explaining that study. And I think one thing that's really noteworthy too is that, uh, one of the thoughts in this study was that people perhaps stopped using some of these techniques that they had developed in the past to cope with heat because they suddenly had an air conditioner that they thought would solve their troubles. And so I think that's really important for all of us to keep in mind as we try to protect ourselves from heat is that, we have these devices that are not perfect, that can fail, and we can't be overly reliant on them. We have to continue with our other strategies, putting down the curtains and closing our windows in the morning. I remember I moved from Portland to the Central Valley in California, and it gets very hot there, about 110, 120 degrees. And I learned very fast by watching, my friends and colleagues who lived there for a long time, what strategies they use. And they did that every single morning. They put down their curtains it was 6 in the morning,
Yep.
closed their windows, pretty much like made the house airtight. And then, when and if the temperatures did cool down at night, then they could open things up. But they use those strategies concurrent with using an AC in the house. So
Right.
I think it's so important to use both, and it's easy to forget when you get a device that it's not enough.
Right. Right. And
It
it,
may not be enough, and maybe part of it is too, like that. In addition to providing people air conditioners, or suggesting that people get air conditioners or heat pumps, there needs to be some sort of a education strategy of like, how do we cope with this, and how do we use these machines in an effective way, in addition to using these other techniques.
yeah, yeah, and really, these techniques are. We've seen folks do energy audits in homes. So people come in and they do a blower test and they figure out how sealed your home is for energy. But we don't have anything of a heat audit of our home yet. And I'd love to see a little more effort going into, like, we can actually go into. I can go into any house now and say, here are 5, 7, 12 things you can do to keep temperatures 5, 10, 15 degrees lower during a heat wave. And
Mhm.
it's really emerging as a science now, and we're getting much better, higher resolution data as a result of these campaigns and a result of these projects like the Home Forward Portland Bureau of Emergency Management project in public housing. We're getting much more granular data to know what works and what doesn't work, and that will only help
Mhm.
enrich the way in which we respond to ever increasing temperatures.
Yeah, and you mentioned these home audits, and you mentioned before some homes being more porous, meaning
Yeah.
they're basically old and not well built, uh, and so there's a big difference in how a house is built, and how temperature impacts that house, which is a good segue to asking you about what the city of Portland is doing in terms of thinking about indoor temperatures and how to perhaps nudge developers to develop a strategy that would basically mandate that temperatures are able to stay below a certain uh, level inside the home.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a few cities around the country that have created this, what are called maximum threshold temperatures. And let me get to that in 1 second, but put a context piece here about every city pretty much in the country has a requirement that every habitable space, meaning any space in a residence that people spend time, has to be able to get up to a temperature of 65 degrees Fahrenheit. So that means it's a comfortable space to actually be in. There has to be some kind of equipment, some means, whether a fireplace or equipment largely, like a heater, that would allow that specific space to get up to 65. And so that is in code. What we don't have, however, is anything that describes what a unit cannot go above. And so that is that maximum temperature threshold. And again, we're still figuring out kind of how hot do residences get. After the 95 heat wave in Chicago, folks were right in those residences, and they were measuring bodies as they were being taken out of some of these apartment and buildings, and they were finding these bodies were 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And as
Wow.
a result, we really didn't know how hot a residence can get. And temperature goes up very slowly. So the resident themselves doesn't know that temperatures are going up in the house, even though their body's reacting by profusely sweating, they're getting dizzy, but yet a lot of folks just don't know, and don't have the response to that kind of impact because of neighborhood conditions, because of historical and conditions, because of their perspective. And so what Portland is trying to do is ensure that there's a maximum threshold. And what it really falls around is about 85 degrees. That is where the body is. Once you go above 85, the body starts really kind of getting a little bit more, not quite hyperthermia, but definitely getting to a point of overheating. And when we get above 90, it's a much higher likelihood that the body's starting to absorb that heat and organs are starting to feel that heat. And then when you go above that critical threshold of 98.6 Fahrenheit or roughly 37 degrees Celsius, our bodies are going to completely overheat. And that's where we're really concerned about it. And so that maximum threshold, being pretty conservative about that. Also, I recognize that, regardless of setting that 85-degree threshold or whatever it ends up being, because that policy is not quite in place and there's still a lot of
Right.
discussion about it, different bodies respond very differently to heat. And so, what
Right.
I would really like to have is a lot more evidence and a lot more data about what it means, uh, what it looks like indoors in different homes, and how different ages, different age people, different demographics, different folks with different health conditions are experiencing that heat. And my hunch is that threshold's actually going to be more like 80 or even 78 than it is going to be 85. And so that's where we get into some really interesting questions around what that number is and what that means, because we really need to be designing these things for the most vulnerable in our community, and those who are going to have a more difficult time coping with heat. And so let's keep that threshold relatively low so that we can find ways to ensure that those communities that do face some severe impacts are able to stay cool in their residences.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really critical because it's only going to get hotter
Yeah,
in the future. So, a house that we design today or that we build tomorrow is going to serve someone for several
that's
decades,
right.
and has to be able to sustain that rise in the heat.
Right.
So, and the way that developers can deal with this is obviously, installing cooling systems indoors or using different types of materials to build the homes. But one way that we can also deal with lowering the temperatures in these neighborhoods, as we talked at the very beginning, is trees.
Hmm.
And this is kind of a non-brainer, maybe, but at the same time, it seems to be kind of an emerging. A science that trees can really help us mitigate heat, and that they are just like the temperatures around the city. Tree canopy isn't distributed equally around the city, so there's some areas that have a lot more trees and others have less. And we've been trying to plant some trees. It's been kind of going slow, but it seems like we now have an opportunity to plant a lot more, partly because there's more focus on trees and their usefulness in combating heat, but also because we are about to get a large influx of money from the Inflation Reduction Act. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about this money that's coming specifically for tree planting, and how this tree planting is different than it used to be in the past.
Yeah. So for better or for worse, I have a lot of work that our lab and our group has done around trees and green space in you know in cities, in regions, and states. And we've been really talking about the why we're seeing differences in heat. A lot of times when we describe those temperature differences of 15, 20, sometimes even 25 degrees Fahrenheit difference between neighborhoods, the immediate response I hear from communities is like, oh, we need to shade those places. Let's get some shade here. And we know that from historic planning processes and programs that some neighborhoods were disinvested and didn't get green space, didn't get trees. And so that has really led to what we call tree inequities across a region. So there's some communities that really benefit from that shade, and other communities that couldn't, that never see that shade or never experience that shade. And so what this Inflation Reduction Act, for example, has $1.5 billion slated for tree canopy programs across the country. And those tree canopy programs are kind of focused on communities that are lower income, communities that are historically kind of disinvested in, and they called in the official language the disadvantaged communities. And the idea is to get trees into the ground in these areas. And that, combined with Oregon's recent legislative passage of the Trees Act that shores up additional funding for doing community tree projects, this scrappy little field of urban forestry has now more resources than it's ever seen in the past. And it really means that are at a moment of really reckoning with how are we going to ensure that these investments are going to protect those most vulnerable and keep those neighborhoods cooler as we see temperatures increasing. And we have a lot of science on this. We know that trees are helpful in some instances, but the moniker goes right tree, right place, and right and if we have a tree that doesn't do well, for example, in hotter climates, and we're putting it into an industrial parking lot where there's a really amplified climates, that tree is going to likely die within a year or two. Whereas if we put a drought tolerant tree where we know that that could really provide shade over the long term, that would be a more effective investment, more bang for your buck, if you will. And so these are the kinds of questions that we're asking, like, what are the trees? Where can you plant them? The challenge, of course, is that some neighborhoods have been so paved over. Back to this question of disinvestment, some neighborhoods have been so paved over decades that you'll have to tear up concrete and to get a tree in. And so the
Mm.
whole question of like, what do you do? How do we do that in an effective way to get a tree in? And how do we create a vibrant, verdant urban forest in these communities around the state? That's a question that each community is going to have to figure out on their own. And that's it's sometimes even more complicated than rocket science, because you're really
Mm.
having to not only get community buy-in and kind of engage a community around this, because a lot of places in the state, the adjacent property owner is responsible for taking care of a tree in the
That's
parking
right.
strip, which is the space between the sidewalk and the road. And so if a city goes in and plants a tree and says, now you're going to have to pay money to take care of any branches that fall, any pruning of that tree, watering of that tree, etc., it creates a very kind of vicious cycle where you're kind of burdening a neighborhood or a community or a household with more responsibility and more financial burden than a city being able to take care of it. So I guess what I get to with a lot of these programs is that it has to be kind of a mutually beneficial project where when you're planting a tree, there is a plan in place for taking care of it in perpetuity. And that there's many models for that as well. And it's really something that we're going to have to try to couple with all of these tree projects that will appear around the state. And my hope is that we're really thoughtful about it. We're engaging communities around it, and we're really finding the right tree, right place, and doing that over time and very systematically. There's some great groups, community-based organizations that are actively working in this space, and I really see the communities have trust these organizations to be able to really administer the programs. And I think that's a very promising outlook for cooling neighborhoods and kind of absorbing stormwater during the rainy season, cooling neighborhoods in the hot season, and cleaning the air as well. And we get all of that for free once we let a tree mature in place.
Yeah, it sounds fantastic, and it sounds like it's going to be a great investment in the communities. I think the perhaps one thing our listeners are asking themselves is that it takes time for a tree to
Mm.
grow. It takes a time for some of these initiatives to uh, have the impacts that they can actually lower the heat in a neighborhood or inside the home. And so I want to end our program today with just a quick piece of advice to our listeners. For those who don't live in a tree neighborhood and can't, uh, you know, maybe hide in a tree forest, what are sort of the top three things that you can do to stay cooler?
Yeah, top three things you can do to stay cooler. The first thing is just really finding the coolest place around you. So it might be as simple as a basement. It might be kind of as simple as the north side of the residence that you're living. And if you don't have those, it might be a community room that you have in your apartment building. We're starting to see an uptick in the idea of resilience hubs, these little rooms or spaces in multifamily residential or even single family residential neighborhoods where you can go to get cool. And so I don't think we've quite gotten there yet in terms of having those available, but just really finding a cool space in your environment. I'd say a really second big thing is, as simple as it sounds, very important, is getting to know your neighbors. We often run into the same challenge when it comes to an extreme event, is that people are so isolated. They're either scared of their neighborhood or not familiar with it, and so they don't engage in conversations. And often the folks immediately surrounding you are the folks that can really help you with things. And I know that the human heart is often really looking for supporting the community, supporting people that are in need. And it's something that's such a simple thing, and you can do it through a block party, or something like that, where neighbors come out. I'm actually organizing one in my neighborhood for this September, so that we can all get out and start to get to know each other and have that conversation, especially after several years of this pandemic and becoming more
Yeah.
isolated. And I think the third thing that I keep hearing from folks is there are a lot of community resources around heat. There are public health agencies, like this heat mapping project will accelerate the amount of resources available. So you can actually get trees planted for free in your parking strip, in your yard. You can get air conditioning or heat pumps if you're qualifying. You can really take advantage of cooling centers if you don't have another place to go. There's a tremendous amount of resources that are materializing both physically and virtually to be able to support communities in times of need. So while the federal government, Federal Emergency Management Agency, still doesn't recognize heat as a natural hazard, local agencies and cities and counties and states are seeing it as a natural hazard, and are putting enormous amount of effort into this right now, because we're seeing increases in impacts happen not only in infrastructure but also in human health. So having a direct link to all the resources that are around you, including what the state and city and region and state and city would provide, your neighbors, as well as your own residents, and finding ways to keep that cool.
Absolutely. And we encourage everyone to check out those resources. Vivek, it's been a fascinating and really important conversation. We're going to be following this topic closely in future stories in the Oregonian and online at OregonLive.com. And thank you so much, everybody, for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, please give us a 5-star rating and review us on Apple Podcasts. It helps us find the show, and please tell a friend. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this is with a subscription to OregonLive.com. You can do that at OregonLive.com/pod support. Until next time, thank you.